So you all got your material, and we'll jump right into it. Hopefully in the future we'll make sure we'll be able to get the material up there on the screen, but otherwise you should have the material you could have printed out, etc., for yourself. So the course we're beginning is called Beyond Right. And this is a JLI course which goes into the idea, what we know in Hebrew, in Judaism, there's an idea called Lifnim Mishurat Hadin, going beyond the letter of the law. That the person should, in their behavior with others, should always go beyond the letter of the law. And this is what this goes into, the various types of situations and of going beyond the letter of the law. But really, this course goes to something much deeper. Because when we address in Judaism the idea of civil laws, the question is, why? Why does Judaism have to have a set of civil laws? Every civilization has their own set of civil laws of how they're supposed to behave and what's correct and what's right and what's wrong. So why does Judaism need to have its own set of civil laws? Wherever people will live, they'll make a set of civil laws. And if we live in our own place, well, then the society then will make a set of civil laws. Why does the Torah give us a whole set of civil laws as if it's some kind of ritualistic, godly thing? The laws, where does the Torah come into it? That's a big question. And the truth is that this is really what this course is coming to answer. That there's always a spirit of the law. The actual civil laws that exist really come from the spirit of the law. What's the spirit of the law? And by the way, this is the reason we find in many different countries, there are different civil laws. The different laws that are governing human beings between each other. Now, on a general basis, and what we're going to get into here is how Jewish, the spirit of Jewish civil law, of all types of all types of laws and behavior between two people, has its own spirit. To the point that we're told in the Torah, Ve'ela Mishpatim, the Shatasim of Flame, these are the laws you should place before them. We are told that when a Jew has a civil issue, even today, you should go to a Jewish court. If the court has the ability to rule, you should go to a Jewish court, not a secular court, because a Jewish court follows the spirit and obviously, therefore, the outcome of the law. While,
okay, I'll turn it in.
Please, everyone, shut. I'll actually close it for it'll be easier. While the while the secular courts are driven by something very different. So, on a very general basis, what drives civil laws in any society? So what drives civil laws in any society is two basic things. One is the protection of rights. Every person has some kind of rights, at least in a Western society. We all have certain rights, and therefore we must in a society protect these rights. So therefore we have to make civil laws that will allow your rights to be protected, because if everybody can do whatever they want, then they can impinge on your rights. They think they want to make use of your house or something else that belongs to you wrongfully. So therefore, we have to protect your rights, we have to make civil laws. And obviously, along with that is to maintain social order in a public domain where people live together. That's what drives general civil laws. But even within there are also many different things that could drive it. And one of the differences we may see is if you look in like the American society as opposed to Canadian and perhaps in the European society, which is even a little bit more emphasized. And that is And that is that in American society, what is the thing you hear about all the time? Whenever people want to talk about protecting the rights, what's the most important right you hear? I'm not talking about gun laws now, but what's the most important right here? You hear freedom. In America, the idea of freedom is something that is cherished above all. The most important thing that America wants to give to its people is the idea of freedom. That's why the whole idea of freedom of speech and freedom of expression and freedom to be able to behave. That's why in America, more than other countries, they had such a hard time in COVID. People felt it was impinging on their freedom, while in places like Canada and Europe did not really have any issue because, yes, freedom is important, but we have other things that drive our society, and that is equality. True equality is an issue that exists in America as well. It's one of the more important things. But freedom is revered in a much higher way, and therefore many of its laws are an expression of making sure that we give people their freedom, total freedom of rights. But in other societies, equality will be more important than freedom, and therefore that's what drives very socialistic societies, about making sure everyone is equal, even though it may take away a little bit some of your freedom of keeping your money, working hard and keeping your money, of being able to saying what you want to say, etc. So in America, Holocaust denial is not outlawed, but in most European countries, Holocaust denial is outlawed because equality is more important than freedom. So this is how we see how every society, even though generally in society there's a social order, etc., but even every society there is a spirit within their sort of spirit of civil law. So the reason Torah has its own civil laws, because it's also driven by a philosophy. It's also driven by a philosophy. What is the main philosophy? Well, we'll just spell it out, and we're going to get into it as we go through. And please, at the end, I just want to make sure who is here, so I make sure I know who came. So, what is the real purpose of Jewish law? And you have it in your in what I sent you for lesson 1, and that is the goal of Jewish civil law is to shape an upright society, not so much to protect your rights, but to do what's right. So Jewish civil law is very much driven about shaping society and doing what is right. And now we were going to go into it to see how it plays itself out. So the idea of what the spirit of the laws, or what the spirit is, how it affects something, is something that is very, very easy to see, and he brings right when we start off on page 3, that asks, or bottom of page 2 and then page 3, it says there's a sports game going on, a game of football, and you were a referee. What are the type of things you would say to the players, as opposed to on top of page 3? And then we're not going to go through. Don't have to. You're looking as we're going on, and as opposed to page 3, if you were a coach, that you have to address the players, what would you say? Now you're talking about the same game, but a coach comes from a very different place than a referee. The main purpose of the referee is to ensure that everyone plays by the rules. So therefore, they're going to emphasize the rules, that you're not allowed to impinge on anyone else's abilities and to follow what you're supposed to. But the coach wants to bring out the best in the players. So the coach therefore may emphasize when they talk to their players something very different than what the referee will. And this is the way it is played out in all the civil laws. And we're going to learn over the next 6 weeks about the Jewish approach of generally trying to shape society and to do what's right, as opposed to most of the secular civil laws that exist in many different governments, which are there to not to do what's right, but to protect your rights. So let's take a look here on text number 1 on page 4. So it says, liberty consists, this is the Declaration of the Rights of Man adopted by the National Assembly of France. Liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. Hence, the exercise of the natural rights of each man has no limits except those which assure to the other members of the society the enjoyment of the same rights. These limits can only be determined by law. So meaning, what is the freedom to do whatever you want as long as it doesn't injure anyone else? That's the main thing of liberty. As long as it doesn't injure anyone else, you can do whatever you want. You have the right to do whatever you want. Nothing can hold you back. Law can only prohibit such actions as are hurtful to society. Nothing may be prevented which is not forbidden by law, and no one may be forced to do anything not provided for by law. So basically, this is what we say about secular law, is that you have the right, and we want to protect your right, as long as you're not hurting anyone else. That is the key thing, as long as you're not hurting anyone else. So now we go to page 5, and let's look at what the Jewish law, what's the spirit of Jewish law? So it says like this. We read page 5. It's from the Abarbanel in his commentary on Exodus, famous commentator who lived in the time of the Spanish Inquisition. He actually was expelled from the country. He was actually even the treasurer for Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. And he's a great scholar. So he writes like this. Every human society requires laws. What is the advantage of God's Torah laws over the legal system set up by other nations? Why does the Torah tell us in Exodus that go to a Jewish court to deal with civil issues? Why? Well, what's the difference? Where does God come into this picture? Why does the verse state that these are the laws you shall set before them, thereby telling us that these laws are a unique divine system exclusively given to us by God? So the answer is, the reason for this is that the divine laws contain elements absent from other legal systems, because God's laws are based on the principles of compassion and goodness. So Jewish laws are driven by compassion and goodness, to do what's right and to be compassionate and good. How do we know that? So if you go to text number 3, page 6, it brings down a verse. The verse says, diligently observe God's commandments that he has commanded you. Do what is right and good in God's eyes. So the Torah demands from us that we should do hayashar v'hatov, what's right and what's good in God's eyes. So the Torah is very clear that it's giving us civil laws because it's driving us to do what's right and what's good in God's eyes. Now, what's the difference between a person having rights and just not injuring someone else than the Torah way of proactively saying, trying to do what's right? How does it really play out the difference? So this is a statement, text number 4 from the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, a very, very powerful and deep statement. And he says like this in his book, in the book Hayom Yom, Daily Thought. It says like this. There are 2 types of laws. A, laws that create life, and B, laws created by life. Human laws are created by life. B, God's law, God's Torah is a divine law that creates life. A. What does this mean? So what it means is that laws that humanity make, really its depth is only because it's created by life. So its depth is only what humanity can figure out to make sure that one person doesn't step on another. They don't know the DNA. Humans don't know the DNA of every person. The only thing we can ensure that life itself can continue, because laws created by life is to ensure that we protect, maintain a social order and protect rights, is that therefore the laws is going to make sure that you cannot hurt someone else. As long as you don't hurt someone else, we can't go further than that. But God's Torah, God's laws, including the civil laws, creates life, as we're told that the Torah is the blueprint of the world. So God looked into the Torah. The Torah was written after the world was created. God looked into the Torah, and through the Torah created the world of humanity. So therefore, the Torah is the blueprint and the DNA of life itself. And therefore, when God made us, he created us to be good and do what's right. And therefore, he made laws that reflect that this Torah has to be one that shapes society and shapes humanity, because he's giving us the guide. You buy a product, you get the instruction book. He's giving us the instruction booklet to use and live our lives fully and to the best. So when God makes laws, it's not just to protect the other person, but it's to help someone develop and do what's good and what's right and become good and a good and upstanding person. So therefore, that's how we see that the Torah takes a very different approach to life in terms of laws that God gave us than the general secular approach. So now we're going to bring 4 cases, situations or cases that happen. And we'll discover a little later the Torah way of dealing with these cases. Meaning, how would regular society or court systems deal with this? And how would Torah deal with this types of cases? So case study 1. This is a story going back to the mid-1800s. Nicholas Young, a German, immigrated to the United States, worked hard, made a living, prospered, and he bought a modest lot on the top of a beautiful California street hill in San Francisco. He built a simple cottage, made a beautiful garden, was so excited to take in the California sunlight and the fresh air. They'll go for his garden and through his windows. And he couldn't imagine, Young had no reason to believe that anything would interrupt his idyllic lifestyle, or that someone could deprive him of the beautiful days he had worked so hard to enjoy. But Young also didn't account for a fellow named Charles Crocker. This Charles Crocker was a very wealthy and petty man who would eventually become the neighbor of Nicholas Young and become the bane of his existence. This Charles was 6 feet tall, 300 pounds, was an imposing figure. He filled his bank account as one of the big 4 barons behind the building of the Central Pacific Railroad. By the 1870s, he could afford whatever he wanted. And what did he want? He wanted a home that would loom over San Francisco. And Crocker and his wealthy partners began looking for a hill with its beautiful views, not far from the financial district. And soon these people were buying up all the homes on their blocks. And Crocker, by the time he was finished buying his lots on California Street, he renamed it to Nob Hill, and he put up a 12,000 square foot mansion. When the project neared completion in 1876, there was one little detail. On the corner, the northeast corner of the block, Nicholas Young didn't want to sell his cottage, and he was dwarfed by the mansions going up all around it. But he enjoyed the neighborhood, didn't want to move. And they didn't get along, and eventually Crocker, at his own expense, erected a wooden fence in his land that towered over 3 sides of Young's home. With its 40-foot tall panels, it acted like a window shade, blotting out the sun and cool air and immersing Young in darkness. Now, this is one case. The question is, should Charles Crocker, who built his fence within his own home, his own property, be legally allowed to stand or not? So this is the question, one case. How does secular law deal with it? And how will Jewish law deal with it? Would it be any different? So that's case number 1. Should Charles Crocker be allowed to keep his fence? Case number 2, page 11. Rachel maintains a beautiful flower bed in her yard. One day, her neighbor built a high wooden fence between the properties and it cast shadow over the garden. Everything died. When Rachel asked Joe why his fence needed to be so high, she was told to protect his birds from cats entering the property. So Rachel offered to replace the wooden fence with a glass screen at her personal expense in order to allow her flowers to receive sunlight without exposing Joe's birds to danger. But Joe refused to allow Rachel to replace the fence without offering any reason. Should Joe be legally required to allow Rachel to replace his wooden fence with a glass screen? That's the question. Is Joe in his full rights? Or could he be required to change the fence that she requested to a see-through, transparent, where he would be protected against the cats and she would have sunlight for her flowers? Question number 2. Case number 2. Case number 3. Michael moves into a new house. Before setting up his own Wi-Fi, he realized that his neighbors have an open Wi-Fi network. Can he use that network without their knowledge? It's case number 3. And case number 4 is number 12. Sarah's next door neighbor David left on a lengthy vacation. It's difficult to find parking on the street, and David's driveway, situated smack in between their two homes, is now empty. Sarah wishes to park her car there while her neighbor is away. Should Sarah be allowed to park her car in David's driveway without his advance permission? So these are the 4 cases, situation. And the question is, what's the secular law? But more importantly, what is the Jewish law? How is Jewish law based on what we said as being good and compassionate, doing what's right? How would the Jewish law deal with Charles Crocker, who built that tall fence? How would Jewish law deal with Rachel's garden and the wall that's blocking the sun, with the Wi-Fi question and the question of the driveway? So these are 4 things, and we'll as we go on, we'll discover what the Jewish law, how the Jewish law approaches it. Now here, figure 1.1, I don't know if it's clear, if you can see it. Here it gives us some, what we call right and good. You should do what's right and good. It gives us a few commandments in the Torah that express what does it mean right and good. Number 1, doing what's right and good means don't stand by when someone's life is at risk. So as opposed to society, where our obligations one to another is just to make sure that we do not harm anyone else, but really beyond that, you don't have to do anything for anyone else. Here, because the Torah is trying to shape society and shape us as good human beings, here when the Torah says do what's right and good, it actually obligates us to do things. For instance, one is that don't stand idly by when someone's life is at risk. If you can help someone whose life is at risk, you have to help them. You can't stand idly by. Number 2, if you see a lost object, you have to pick it up and return it to its owner. And it's an obligation that the person has to pick it up. Number 3, you have to provide roadside assistance. You see someone who's broken down, you have to stop and ask them what help they need. And number 4, let us spread gossip. Now, all of these 4 things in secular society, they don't exist. You don't have to intervene when someone's life is at risk. You don't have to pick up a lost object. I think the law is if you pick up a lost object, you have to find the owner, but you don't have to pick up a lost object. And Judaism, Torah warns us that you can't go away and imagine the lost object is not there. You have to pick it up. If you notice it, you have to pick it up. In secular, you don't have to provide roadside assistance, and there's no real law against gossip. As long as you're not hurting anybody physically, etc., you can say whatever you want. So these laws, you can say whatever you share with anyone about anything that you want to share with them. So these laws are laws that are specific to Jewish laws because you should do what's good and proper. So now let's understand what is the spirit of the law. How is it spelled out, the spirit of the law? What does it mean do what's good and right? How do we define what's good and right? How does it work? So in text number 5, on page 13, he brings Nachmanides. Nachmanides says like this: our sages expounded on this verse, they should do what's good and right, and explained that it instructs us to go beyond the letter of the law. Meaning, according to Jewish law, you have to go beyond the letter of the law. In other words, the Torah first exhorts us to observe all the God's commandments. So meaning, firstly, the Torah gives us the baseline that we have to fulfill all the commandments that the Torah commands us, the 613 commandments and its details you have to fulfill. On top of that, and then now instructs us to be careful to do that which is right and good. So meaning there are two layers, because the Torah almost mentions it twice. It said you should do what's right, then it says that you should do what's right and good. So the Torah is telling us there are two layers. One layer is that there's laws, and obviously laws you have to follow, the laws that you were told to do. But on top of that, it says, on top of that, even when not explicitly commanded to do so, you should still do what's right and good, because God cherishes good and proper conduct. So there's another layer that even when it's not commanded and it's not a law, you still should behave in a proper manner of doing what's right and good. This instruction is very important because it would be impossible for the Torah to exhaustively address all of our conduct with our friends and neighbors, all of our business affairs and welfare side. The Torah can't detail every detail of any type of situation you may find yourself in. So the Torah lays down some general rules of what's obligated that we can, that becomes a mitzvah and that you have to behave. And on top of that, the Torah expects you on your own, in all different types of situations, you should do what's right and what's good. Instead, after offering a multiple specific commandments, such as you should not go about as a gossip monger, don't take revenge or bear a grudge, do not stand by the shedding of your fellow's blood, do not curse even a deaf person, stand in the presence of the aged, the Torah then concludes with the generalized command to do that which is right and good, meaning go beyond the letter of the law. So Nachmanides says that's what the Torah teaches us. The civil laws, even there are two ways, two things. One is their laws, things that there's no way out. This is the Torah demands, this is the law, you have to behave that way. The other thing is you have to go beyond the letter of the law. You have to be driven to do what's right and good, even if the law doesn't force you to do it. You're still on your own, you should do it. The Torah leaves us much space where we in our own lives can do what's right and we're good out of our own accord. So now to understand that a little more clearly, how do we know? How can we define? What does it mean what's right and what's good? At what point, how much you have to go out of your way to do what's right and what's good? What is the line? You know, in secular society, the line is very clear. As long as it doesn't injure someone else or hurt someone else, I can do it. It's very clear. It's very defined. But in the Torah, it's not defined. What does it mean right and good? How far do you go? What are the things that Torah doesn't want us to, wants us to stay away from? This is not right and good. So here he brings text number 6 from the Talmud. Page 15. The Talmud says, a person is compelled by law not to act in a manner characteristic of the inhabitants of Sodom. We all know about the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, which God had planned to, which God had destroyed. Who was Sodom and Gomorrah? I want it to be when the Talmud says, don't act in a manner characteristic of the inhabitants. Who is this? What is really going on? What do they represent? So he says like this. This is very fascinating. So he brings a Mishnah, text number 7a. So the Mishnah says like this. It's one who insists, what is mine, what is yours, is of average character. I mean, the Mishnah addresses how people view money, their money and someone else's money. So one of the things it says, that someone who says that mine is mine and what's yours is yours, this is the average person. However, another opinion maintains that such an attitude is characteristic of the wicked people of Sodom. That this type of attitude, what's mine is yours, and what's yours is not the average person. It says that this is the characteristic of Sodom, which was a city that was destroyed. The only city that was destroyed in the history is this city. How could it be that the same behavior to one opinion is just an average person? And to another person, this is the most corrupt and terrible behavior that the whole city deserved to be destroyed. How does it work? So the Meiri, one of the early commentators, about 800-900 years ago, he writes, he explains this in a very beautiful way. It says like this, text number 7b. Both statements in the Mishnah are valid, because the second view, which classifies as contract as wicked, refers to those who refuse to permit others to benefit from them, even when they will incur no personal or monetary expense as a result. Such conduct is characteristic of the inhabitants of stone. So when do we say that what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours, don't touch what's mine at all? When do we say that this is like the characteristic of Sodom? If a person can partake of something that's yours without any loss or any setback to you at all. So there's no loss or setback to you. And still no, you say, I don't want you to touch this what's mine or use this what's mine. When Hebrew it's called zen. If someone can benefit, the other person has no loss, and you don't let the person benefit, this is the characteristic of Sodom. That you are so against letting someone else benefit from you in any way, that even if there's no loss for you, there's nothing, not time, not anything, no loss for you, no money, and you still don't want it, that's done. But by contrast, the first view in the Mishnah, which classifies this conduct as average, refers to those who refuse to allow others to benefit from them when doing so would come at a personal monetary expense. If a person says what's mine is mine, yours is yours, because for you to partake in something that belongs to me, it would cost me either money or time. And the person says, I don't want to spend any time or money for you. So then the Mishnah says that's an average person. That's not wicked. Individual adopt this approach cannot be compared to the inhabitants of Sodom because they seek simply to avoid incurring losses through the action of others, just as they would not inflict a loss upon their fellows. This indeed reflects the average character. So the Mishnah was really telling us to not contradicting itself. It's not contradicting itself. And the Mishnah is telling us like this, that the average person, whoever says mine is mine, yours is yours, therefore I don't want to share what's mine with yours, is referring to a situation when it would take up some time or money, and I don't want to do that. For there, the Mishnah may not be happy, but it says this is the average person. Yes, people don't want to spend their money in that way. They don't have to spend their money in that way. But if someone is not going to incur any loss by you benefiting from what they have, and it won't cost them any time or anything, and they still don't want to let you have or use what they have, this is a characteristic of Sodom. So when we say to do what's right and good, what it means is that if someone can benefit from you and it costs you nothing, then for sure that's what's right and good, and that's what you should do. And we'll soon see some examples. The first example he brings is text number 8, page 18. It's from Maimonides. So Maimonides tells us a law, laws of neighbors. And he says like this: a person has windows set in the lower portion of the wall of his house, and his neighbor desires to erect a building that will block them. Right? So you have the windows in the first floor of your house. Someone wants to build a wall or a building that will block your windows. The neighbor proposes to solve the problem by installing new windows in the upper portion of the homeowner's wall. So now the neighbor says, I know I'm blocking your window, but I'll build you a window in your house higher. I'll pay for the expense. So therefore the higher window will not be blocked by my wall. If this arrangement won't cause the homeowner any difficulty at all, will not require him to leave his home during the construction, he cannot prevent the new neighbor from performing this construction. The homeowner is compelled by law to allow the neighbor to close the windows in the bottom part of his wall and create new windows higher up. This is because it would be Sodom-like conduct for the homeowner to refuse this accommodation. So meaning, this is a case of this one benefits, this one doesn't. So I need to build a wall. It blocks you. So you cannot say, listen, box me and that's it, don't build a wall. No, I say, no, I'll build a wall. It blocks you. I'll give you a new opening higher up, it won't block you. So you cannot hold me back from building the wall. And I have to cover the this is called doing what's right and good. Now, I don't know how the secular over here is in Canada, but I don't have to do. I don't necessarily have to in philosophy. I don't have to necessarily accommodate you. I have my right to keep what I had before that window on the bottom, and I want to keep it. You can't force me to change it. But in Jewish law, you could force other. Why? Because you have to do what's right and good. If you can help your neighbor by not really losing anything. Meaning you're not holding on to because it's a war, it's an ego, who's going to be stronger, me or my neighbor. If you have a reason that you need to keep the bottom window and therefore the upper window won't replace it, that's a different story. Then you're losing something. The Torah doesn't mandate you to do what's right and good. But if you're not really losing anything because the light you'll get from the upper window, then you cannot hold the person back from building the wall, and he will do your window. This principle applies to every situation. One individual will benefit while his fellow will not lose anything as a result. In all such cases, the relevant party is compelled by law to cooperate because this is the way Jewish law says, do what's right and what's good. Do what's right and what's good means that if someone could benefit and you won't lose, that is actually mandated by law. So Jewish law, this is not even the goodness of your heart. It's mandated by law. They can force, the Jewish court can force you to follow through with what they want to do. So now, let's look at, on page 19, the two cases, A and B. The A case was with the fellow Crocker who built a tall wall. Charles Crocker built this 40-foot wall. What would be the Jewish law? Is he allowed to build the 40-foot wall? It's first on one hand, it's in his property. So he says, it's my property, I can do what I want. No one can stop me from doing what I want on my property. There was a famous story, man, when I was growing up, Donald Trump wanted to build like a big hotel in Atlantic City, and he bought up all the houses on a block, and one guy didn't sell him, one person didn't sell him the house, and he built a big, massive building towering over this house because he had the rights. It was his, he owned the land around, he could do whatever he wants, even though it took away the person's sunlight and everything else, but he could do whatever he wants. So what does Jewish law have to say? Could the guy do it or not? So the answer is that this is not in the spirit of doing what's right and good. Even though it's in your property, you have no right to take away from the other person's piece of land. Actually, this Charles Crocker, he built this wall to spite his neighbor. It's not only the question, is he doing what's right and good or not? He built this wall only to spite. He was unhappy that he had a neighbor there. He didn't want the neighbor. So he wanted to make him feel terrible. So he built the wall to spite his neighbor. And I think even in many secular countries, there is a law that you're not allowed to do something to spite. Is there or not? I think there is a law you're not allowed to do something to spite. But Torah was the first one that introduced it. That even though it's in your own rights to do what you want, and the neighbor can't say, listen, why are you building a big wall? It's my property. I can do whatever I want. I'm not impinging on your property. I'm building a tall wall. So obviously in the Torah law, Charles would have to take his wall down. Not allowed to keep a tall wall there to hurt someone else. What about in the case of the woman Rachel, who the guy built the wall because he had a good reason, it's not in spite. He didn't do it to spite her. He built the wall because he wanted to make sure the cats don't harm his birds. But this woman came up to him with the solution. She said, listen, keep the wall. I'm going to pay for it to make it transparent so the sunlight comes through and my garden doesn't die. See here, even though he's not doing it spite, then maybe it will be in his rights and other systems, but in the Torah law, he would have to let her build. If that was his reason, not doing it despite, he's doing it because he's trying to protect his birds and cats, but she's offering him that he won't lose, that he'll have a wall tall enough that the cats will not be able to harm his birds, and she is not going to be hurt by having the sun blocked. Now the sun will come through. So these two cases, A and B, it's a very clear thing in Torah that these two situations, Charles has no right to make that wall, be forced to be taken down, and the other person has to let her make this this wall out of glass or transparency, so her flowers won't be hurt. So here we see is how doing what's right and good will affect directly these two cases, these two situations. Now here in text 9, we learn something even more. Fascinating thing. Looks similar to squatters, but we'll explain soon it's not exactly 100%. So Talmud says like this: if one lives in his fellow's yard without the latter's knowledge, does he have to pay him rent or not? So let's say you have a home, it's empty, you're not renting it out, you're on a long-term vacation, or you live somewhere else basically, and someone goes into, he sees the house is empty, and needs a place to live, he goes into the house to live, comes a squatter. Does he have to pay rent or not? Meaning when he's found out, the owner finds out that someone is living in his house, can he force him to pay rent or not? That's what the Talmud says. So the question the Talmud says is in regard to a yard that is not on the market for rent, but the squatter is a person who usually rents. What is the law? So meaning, we're not talking about a homeless person who can't pay rent, because that may be a different question. We're talking about a person who could pay rent, but he sees empty home and he doesn't want to pay rent. Can the squatter say to the owner, what loss have I caused you? So meaning, is the squatter allowed to say to the owner, we have this concept of zen nene, zele chaser, where this one benefits, the other one doesn't lose, that you can force a situation when one person benefits, the other one doesn't lose. So here, because it fall under the situation of this one benefit, this one doesn't lose, that he cannot throw the squatter out of the house, or he can tell him you have to pay me rent. Because he says, what loss have I caused you? Or perhaps the owner can insist, look, you have benefited from my property instead of paying rent elsewhere. So the question is, does he have to pay? This is a case in which one individual benefits while the other one does not lose anything. So what's the story? What does the Talmud conclude? Rabbi, the son of Rav Huna, stated, my father ruled in the name of Rav that the squatter does not have to pay rent. So if you come to the squatter and you say, pay rent, you have to pay me rent for all the months you live in my house, he can say, I don't know. He said, no, the Torah says don't have to pay rent. So now, this is taking the case of the one person benefits, the other one doesn't lose, a little further. We're not talking about the wall, if it's transparent or not. They were talking about someone goes into your private house, breaks into your house, and now is living in your house, and you're saying, pay me rent for the months you live there. And the Talmud says, no, if he benefited and the other one didn't lose, you don't have to pay rent. So he says, the Tosfos, the commentary, Rashi's grandchildren, says like this. We only, in text number 10, we only compel the property owner not to conduct himself like the inhabitant of stone regarding the past. The squatter residing in his property without paying rent is not compelled to pay rent for the past. At the same time, it is clear that the property owner has the right to protest the squatter's presence and need not permit the squatter to remain in his property. See here, the Tosfos gives a very fascinating sort of line. It says like this discussion of the Talmud, if he has to pay rent, it's talking about when you found him, he has to pay rent for the past. But when you find him, you say, get out of my house now, then the Talmud does not say then the clause that this one benefits, this one doesn't lose, you have to let him be there. Only related to the past if he has to pay the rent for what he used, but not for future. For future, if you tell him leave the house, doesn't want to pay rent, he has to leave the house. Why? How could you make this difference? Don't they both fall under the category of this person is benefiting, the person who's living in the house is benefiting while the other person has no loss? They're living in your house and there's no loss. We're talking about a case where there's no loss. Forget about they're not using your electricity, not using anything else. They're just using the rooms and they're keeping it, maintaining it. There's no loss to you. So what's the difference? Why only for the past you don't have to pay rent, but for the future you can kick him out of your house? So Shimon Shkop, who was what we call an Achron, he was lived 300 years ago, who explained a lot of Talmudic discussions, and he tells us why there is a difference, why it only works in the squatter for the past but not the future. In my opinion, he says, the reason Tosfos rules that the property owner cannot be actively compelled to allow a squatter on his property is because compulsion in such an instance will be a forcible negation of the property owner's control of his own property. Most people would object to this. The failure of an individual to consent to something that most people would object to cannot be said, I don't like. conduct. However, the squatter's presence in the property without the owner's knowledge doesn't negate the owner's control of the property because the owner retains the right to evict the squatter at any time. So here he says like this, there's a difference, a very fine difference between charging the squatter for the past or the squatter having the right to stay in the future. The difference is like this. When it comes to property, part of ownership of property is the ability for you to decide who's going to live in that property or not. It's not like, and we're going to see later a case, there is a case, for instance, let's say you leave your tefillin in synagogue. And someone comes to shul one day and doesn't have a pair of tefillin. He's allowed to take your tefillin without even asking you. Because you don't lose anything. Your tefillin is sitting there, you're not using it now. So he's going to gain, you're not going to lose. So you can use it, not a problem. But when it comes to property, part of ownership of property means that I can control who goes into my property, doesn't go into my property. So if I find a squatter there now, I can tell him now, my ownership gets expressed by being able to tell him, you cannot live in my property. But the fact that he lived there for 6 months already, I cannot charge him the rent because I didn't lose anything. So I can't go back and charge the rent because I didn't lose anything. But that right to tell him you have to leave my house now is part of my ownership rights. Or else I don't really have ownership. If I can't even stay in my own house, who can stay, who can stay, I don't really have ownership in my house. So it's an effect on your ownership. Therefore, it's a fine thing. But the future, he can kick out the squatter. But for the past, he still can't charge. So here we see much clearer that the idea is when one person benefits, another person doesn't lose, that even if theoretically you could have made money for the rent, but you didn't. You weren't interested. You didn't even have a for rent sign. If you had a for rent sign, the law would be differently. Because maybe people seeing someone living there would think it's not for rent anymore. Then you had a loss, probably. But if you didn't have a for rent sign, you weren't renting it out, it's just sitting there. You bought a building, you're planning to do it over one day, and people see an empty building, and they squat the building. Then it's a different story. So, how does this affect the last two cases, C and D, the case of the Wi-Fi? I move next door and I open up and I see you have an open Wi-Fi. Can I use it or not? Or the last case, which was related to the driveway. You're away for a while, you went away for the winter. It's easier for me to park my car in your driveway. There's no place in the street. You're not there anyways. So here will be very interesting. According to Jewish law, C, Wi-Fi may not work. Why? Because, first of all, obviously the person doesn't have unlimited Wi-Fi, whatever you're using, it's going to cost them. But even if he does have unlimited Wi-Fi, very often in Wi-Fi, the more users that are on there, the slower my Wi-Fi is. So in that type of situation, when every user puts a little more weight on the Wi-Fi, there you may be able to say, you're benefiting, but I'm losing. I'm losing the quickness, I'm losing something. So in that case, you can say, don't use my Wi-Fi. Or you're not allowed to use the Wi-Fi. You're not allowed to say, listen, he's not losing anything. No, they are losing something. Because the Wi-Fi, usually they will lose something. But the driveway, they lose nothing. If someone sits in your driveway, you lose nothing. The country may be even better for you. Someone thinks you're home. And a thief will not come into your house. So if they ask you and you say no, you have a right, because that's part of ownership. But if they didn't ask you and they did it, and then you found out they didn't, you can't come say, no, so pay me rent for $100 a month that you put. No. Because you had no loss and had no gain. So here we have the difference between the past and the future. But here we have the story where it shouldn't be, you don't even have to ask. Like I told you, with someone who come into shul and you need someone's tefillin and you don't have tefillin, you can take anyone's tefillin and pray with you. So here we see how we're doing what's right and good and right. Ultimately, the Torah can't force you if there's a loss. If there's no loss, the Torah can force you and makes the rules. But if there is a loss, the Torah will not force you. That's how those four cases work its way out. Now, even though the Torah does not force you to take a loss to help someone else, meaning, but if there's no loss, the Torah will force you, but not if there's a loss. So yet, still no, there's a third layer. So besides the laws that the Torah obligates us how we have to behave, then there's the laws that obligate us based on being good, doing what's good and right, and helping to shape proper society and shape humanity and shape our character to be good, etc. So then you have to the laws related to it. But then there is some type of doing what's good and right where there is a loss to you, but still the Torah says you should. I can't force you, but you should do what's good and right. And there they can't force, but you should do it. And we bring an example, text number 12, from a great rabbi. So Rabbi Bar Chanan, Rabbi the son of Bar Chanan, his barrel of wine was negligently broken by the porters he hired to transport it. So some wine came in, barrels came in, and he had a bunch of porters transport it, and they broke the barrels. So Rabbi seized the porters' cloaks as payment for the damage. They caused them damage, the wine, the barrels. So he seeks some value from the porters. So the porters complained to Rav, who instructed Rabbi to give them back their clothes. He told Rabbi, you have to give them back their clothes. Rabbi asked, is that the law? Are you telling me the laws I have to give them back their clothes? They made me a big loss. Rab replied, yes. I stated in the verse, in order that you follow the path of the good people. So he said, yes, it is the law. Rabbi returned the porter their clothes. The porters complained further to Rab, we are poor, and we labored all day. Now we're hungry and have nothing to eat. So yes, we broke this guy's barrels, but we're poor, and we were hoping that he would pay us. We have something to eat. Now we have nothing to eat. Rav told Rabbi, pay them their wages. Even though, now I gave them back their clothes, but I said, pay them their wages, even though they broke, you had a loss with them. Rabbi asked, is that the law? Rabbi responded, yes. I stayed in the verse and observed the ways of the righteous. Now, is it really the law? I mean, here we're talking about a case where for Rabbi Bar Chanan, it's a loss. These porters negligently broke his thing. They didn't take care of it carefully. They broke his barrels. He lost the wine. The barrels he lost. And here Rabbi is telling him that you have to give them back their clothes. You have to pay them a wage. Is it really the law? So the commentators on the Talmud explain, no, it's not the law. But Rav was telling Rabbi Chanan, who's a leading scholar in the Jewish people, he said, for you, it's like a law. Meaning, because of your stature, you should behave beyond the letter of the law. So you even though the law is, and you go to court, they cannot force you to do any of these two things, but you should behave better than the law. That's what he told him. So here we have the three levels, and that's what you see on page 26. The obligation specified by the Torah, A, is the obligation specified by the Torah, the explicit commandments, such as those detailed in figure 1:1, where we said before, do not gossip, and do not, and we said the four things that we brought down there. Don't gossip, don't, where is it? Don't stand by while your fellow is, your life is at risk. Pick up a lost object. Those are mandated laws. B, and why are those mandated laws? Because the Torah says do what's good and right, so therefore we mandate you have to behave in such a way. The next thing is doing the right thing in favor of a fellow when no personal expenses incurred. Such conduct was made legally binding by rabbinical law. So even then, the next level is where when there's no loss to the other person, and one person benefits and the other person has no loss, you also should do what's right. You also should do what's right. And we obligate to do what's right. Like we brought down some of the cases we brought down over here. But then C is doing the right thing in favor of a fellow despite personal expense or loss. Like we just said by Rabbi, the son of Chanan, where they broke his barrel, such conduct is not legally obligatory, but it's nevertheless encouraged. So in Jewish law, the idea of doing what's right and good, and that's what the whole idea of civil laws is doing what's right, is one that has expressed in three ways. One is it's simply law. So the whole civil laws are driven by it. The other one is doing something when there's no expense incurred, and letting someone benefits you when there's no expense incurred, and that's also obligational. The other one is doing what's right, even if there is a loss. Like Rabbi Chanan doing what's right, this is not obligated, but still it's in the right spirit of the Torah. So now we'll see here, before we go after the key points, I want to read first. There's page number 29. I want to read 29 and the next one, and then we'll go back to the Kikos. So page 29 brings up a piece of Talmud. It says like this: a man once rented his mill to his fellow in exchange for milling services, meaning the renter would pay for the rental by grinding the owner's grain upon the man. So how did he pay his rent? By grinding the owner's grain as well. Later, the mill owner became rich. He purchased another mill on a donkey and no longer required the renter's regarding services. So now the renter is still renting, but the one who rented it to him doesn't need his services anymore. And now what happens? The mill owner said to the renter, until now you milled my grain as rent payment for the mill. It was a barter. Now, since I no longer require the service, give me cash payments for the mill stuff. So the guy is renting from you. Before you made a deal, how he can rent, he can pay it by doing a service. Now you don't need the service, you say, now pay me cash. So the renter replied, I will grind for you because that's what I agreed to. I never agreed to pay cash. Meaning you rent it to me not on a cash basis, and I can't pay you cash, and therefore I'll still continue to give my service, even though you don't need it. The renter's response is justified. If there isn't enough local demand for grinding services to operate the mill full time, and he would use the slack time to grind the owner's grain and thereby pay his rent. Under such circumstances, switching to cash payments will cause the rent an actual loss. So here, the renter, even though now he has his own mill, but here he can, because he rented it based on doing a barter deal, if the mill guy cannot keep himself busy enough without the mill owner's grain, then he can force him to give him the grain. He says you have no choice, you have to give me the grain. But however, if there's sufficient local demand for grinding service to operate the mill full time, and instead of grinding the owner's grain, the renter can grind for other people for a fee, thereby the money needed to pay rental, he's compelled by law not to act like the inhabitants of the stone and pays rental fee cash. So meaning, initially you agreed on a deal. The renter says you can't change the deal. This is the deal I agreed on. I can't change the deal. And he's right, you can't change the deal. But if the renter, there's enough business, if he just gets off his behind, he'll find enough business that he can take up the space that you were and earn cash and be able to pay the rent in cash, you can force him to do it. Because you benefit, you already have a place to make to grind you have your own mill that's going to do the work. And he will just go and get the other customers. So there you can force him to change the deal of your rental agreement, because here you gain, but he doesn't really lose. So he has to find other customer, but that's not called a loss. So here's another case where we see how you're doing what's right affects actually in this way. And I'll bring you one more example. It's on page 31. It's a not very well-known law, but it's very real. And here you see how doing what's right and good plays itself out in a very real way. And we were actually involved in a case like that once. So it's a page 31, text 14. It sounds like this. If someone sells property to someone other than the neighbor who owns the adjacent property, the neighbor has the right to reimburse the buyer for the purchase and eviction. He has the right. So meaning, so let's say I have a property and someone owns a property next door. And that person next door sells the property to someone else. And I go and I go to the buyer and I say, listen, this guy was my neighbor. I'm going to pay whatever you paid him, and you get to give me the property. So the Torah said that's the law. It's called bar metzra, the law of the neighbor. The law is based on the verse, do what's right and good. Sage explained that since the sale price is the same and it's right and good, the property should be acquired by a neighbor rather than a distant person. So here, this is something that's very real. That according to the Torah law, a neighbor has first right a refusal for a property. And even if the property was sold, as long as they're ready to pay the same amount for what you sold the property, he has the right to take it away from the buyer and be the purchaser of the property. Why? Because you have to do what's right and good. And it's obviously much better, it's more beneficial for a neighbor, if he's interested in a piece of property, to have the neighboring property than someone else out of the random to have this property. So the idea of doing what's right and good is what drives the law, in obligational things. B, when there's no loss, and C, even we should try to do it even when there's no obligation at all. And we're meaning with there isn't a bit of a loss. So we see these are the underlying system of the Jewish system of law. Civil law is shaped by Hashem, who's our coach. Hashem is our coach. Hashem gave us the Torah, and He's coaching us to help us become fine people, good character, doing what's right and what's good, above just protecting what's yours and being like a carnivore that just takes in and just wants to figure out, use the law, how to protect what's yours, instead of as being a good member of society to be able to do what's right for the bigger good, for others around you, etc. And therefore we can compel you that when you're not losing, someone can gain, you have to be the first one to let them gain from you. Like we said, you can use your driveway if we didn't ask you. You can put on your tefillin. Obviously, things that cause wear and tear, things that cause, it's a different story. There's a loss. But if there's no loss at all, then definitely something in the past. They don't have to ask you something in the past, but if they ask you, when it comes to ownership of things, your right of ownership will allow you to preclude them and say no. So we'll finish off with the key points on page 28. A, all legal systems, one, are shaped by the underlying values, but this is especially true of Jewish law. While secular law views its purpose as maintaining social order by protecting individuals, Jewish law sees its purpose as shaping society by guiding individuals to do what's right and upstanding in God's eyes. Jewish law forbids spiteful conduct. Spite fences are forbidden, and people can be compelled, that's the story with Crocker, to allow changes to their property that benefit others and come at no personal cost, which is the story of the glass wall. 4, certain unauthorized use of other people's property that cause no harm to the owners are permitted by Jewish law. However, the owner generally retains the right to object. As long as they didn't object, it's fine. But if they object, you have to stop, which is the squatters. When doing the right thing in favor of a fellow entails a degree of personal expense laws, Jewish law declines to mandate it, but nevertheless encourages people to adopt this praiseworthy approach. This is the opening of helping us understand how we have to behave in the Jewish way and how it shapes the laws. Just want to make sure I have everybody who came. Okay, Norman Goldberg, I have here. Waknin and Associates, who is that? Danielle Waknin? Okay. And let's see who else. Val's iPhone, we went through already. Jonathan Liber, Leonel, Benamu, Gila, Myrizer, Godfrey Enter, Tiffany, Valerie's phone, iPhone, Howard Greenspoon. Okay, so next week we'll be back on the same time. Thank you very much. And have a happy Shavuot.
Thank you.
Okay, beautiful, great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah.